Mate, listen, are you around the next couple of days?
I am.
Are you around tonight?
All right, James. How you doing?
All right, nice to see you again. Nice to be back.
So, last book, went through into amongst the ultras. What was your experience in talking to football supporters and like the ultras culture in Saudi Arabia, and what does that look like in this kind of nation that is building a sports culture very quickly?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Saudi Arabia's got a huge sports culture and a big fan culture. I mean, they've had football for decades. Al Hilal, Al Nasser derby is like one of the biggest in the world, right? So it's not that they've never had fan culture before, but what it is that ultra culture has just become absolutely global. Even if you look at like English football, like there's club approved tifos at games now, which is something you would never have seen even 10 years ago. So I was kind of on the lookout when I went to Riyadh for the first time, thinking that they're not going to have ultras. But of course, I went to Al Nasser. They had a group called Curva Sud. They had their own tifo. It was sponsored by a local travel agency. It was Ronaldo on a ship. It was quite funny. So of course, like your tifo, your whatever choreography that you choose kind of reflects the country in a way. And of course, it's not anti-anything other than the opposition. You're not seeing 1-3-1-2, you're not seeing all cops are bastards on any curva in Saudi Arabia yet. But it's interesting that culture is permeated almost every part of football fan culture around the world. And you know, Saudi Arabia is no different.
Are you seeing banners and messages of any kind, of any political nature?
No.
Though? Like even in the game against, for instance, an Iranian team, where
you still can hear chants and kind of, so there is still kind of political messaging and booing and these kind of things. But what's interesting is that in the past, it used to be much more open for fans to, and kind of not quite encouraged, but for Saudi football fans to criticise the team, criticise the president of the club, who's often a member of the House of Saud. So I spoke to plenty of Saudis who told me about like how it used to be. It was a kind of accepted part of society that you would have football fans criticise, you know, a member of the House of Saud, not based on political reasons, but because of football reasons, because their team isn't being invested in or it's being mismanaged. They saw it as a kind of like a valve that could be opened and closed, so that if they're complaining about the royal family in terms of football,
the other teams are the royal family.
Exactly.
And lamentation about them.
And so you're not complaining about the fact that, you know, there are not enough Saudi jobs, or that the wages are too low, or that the price of petrol goes up, or subsidies for housing have been cut. There is always a little bit of space for criticism in football, and Saudi was no different. But it's become a very kind of strange country in terms of, on the one hand, it's had this incredible reform process where women go to football matches now. Women are in public life. Music, you'd never even hear music. It was banned until 2018 in public. You don't see the religious police anymore. You barely, and this is one thing I only noticed when I left the second time, like you barely hear the call to prayer in Riyadh, which is mad when you think about it, you know. So there's that on one side, but on the other side, it's never been less free. And so all political rights are gone, all freedom of speech is gone. Any criticism whatsoever on social media can get you a 20-year prison sentence. It's the harshest social media laws in the world.
Something I experienced when we were researching this, also our own experiences in researching Saudi football, was you'd have supporters have their agents transferring them from one club to another.
Yeah,
right.
I heard that, yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that dynamic, and also this idea of like supporters being hired from North African countries? Or
well, look, this is a well-worn path. I mean, you know, you have the Blue Power, this big group. It's a huge job to have that. I mean, they do big tifos, they've got big numbers, big supporters. It's also a highly skilled job, you know, so I'm not that surprised, right? You've got to find someone who can actually organise, you know, 5,000 people, move them around the country when they go to football matches. You have to organise a tifo, which in itself is a complicated art project. We also see, you know, fans being paid to go, like in terms of like in lower league teams, like at Neom. When I went to Neom, this club that's been bought by this $1.5 trillion. The club was called Al Sukur, now it's called Neom. And of course, there's some local fans, but a lot of them are, you know, fans who have been encouraged to go, paid to go, and they make up a kind of selection of the fans there. So, and you've seen that in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in UAE. So, but that doesn't. That's when they want to manipulate something, or the authorities want to manipulate something. When there's a real rivalry, when there's something riding on it, where it's an important game, when it's Al Ittihad versus Al Hilal, like you're not going to be able to get a ticket months in advance. And it's one of the best atmospheres you'll see in football. It's incredible.
To that point, like with the Qatar World Cup, right?
Yeah.
We saw Qatar kind of quickly try and fabricate a national supporters group for its national team.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think we're going to see by the time we reach the World Cup in 2034 in terms of a Saudi supporters culture?
Qatar's a much smaller country. It does have quite an interesting football heritage, and weirdly, football was better supported back in the 70s and 80s when the country had just begun. But one of the things I spoke to a lot of Qatari people about building a kind of fan culture is that the Qataris, or certainly through the Aspire Academy, had started sending capos from Turkey to Lebanon to hook up with some of the ultra groups there to build up a kind of bank of songs, how to teach them what tifos to do, choreographies, all these kind of things. It's image and information manipulation. The same with buying this club, but turning it into neon and then transplanting it. Like, it's just bending reality. Because I went and stood with them during a game, and it's like, you know, the first guy I saw had a neck tattoo. You don't see a Saudi with a neck tattoo unless they've really fallen off the wagon, you know what I mean? When I wrote that story, you know, people who are critical of Westerners criticising anything to do with the Qatar World Cup. What was interesting is that anybody who spoke Arabic, anybody from the Arabic world saw that where they're like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. Because it was clearly they weren't Qatari. They could hear they weren't Qatari when they were singing it. And of course they were clearly not Qataris.
In this idea of cultural capital, I think it's really interesting that they're also consciously aware of buying up the rituals of the stand, right? And so it's not just, you know, it's not just buying the team. It's not just, they've gone the next step with it, which is actually kind of buying the community around that team, which is the thing we always said as fans wasn't for sale.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't a new process. I mean, I focus in on Newcastle United because it was such a high-profile purchase, and it was a very controversial process, and there's all sorts of reasons for it. But the first time I saw it, like up close, was Portsmouth. In the end, the club went bankrupt or went into administration, fell down to the 4th division, and became a fan-owned club. Fantastic example of what fan power could do. As soon as an American owner came in, a billionaire owner, and said, like, we can restore you back to the Premier League, all of that went out the window. And what was important was the prestige of the club. It was interesting because so many people talked about that culture, and that fan culture needs to be preserved, and we've got our own club back. But very quickly that changed when the other priorities became, well, a priority. And so it was a very similar thing to Newcastle United in that they literally had to almost give away season tickets or half-season tickets at the end of the Ashley regime because people were so fed up with the way he was using the club as a kind of billboard for Sports Direct. They've had it cheapened them, and it cheapened their club, and it cheapened their, you know, this club is their family, it's their identity to their geographical location, it's their class, it's all these things. And so the Saudis coming in, and they know this, they know that they buy like a distressed asset and they make it whole again, that they know that they are tapping into a potential huge well of support, which has kind of been shown with Saudi Arabia. It's definitely been shown with Manchester City and Abu Dhabi. I mean, if you see the discourse online, the discussions are all like UAE government talking points. You know, that this is any criticism of Manchester City is anti-Arab racism, that this is, you know, this is the big six red cartel, all these phrases which are then you start hearing at Newcastle. It's not that they're buying the rituals, right? They're trying to, what they want is an organic way, have a forward operating base. They want an army of people who will back them, support them. You can have a bot farm in Riyadh that does this. It's very difficult to make it authentic. Sometimes the most authentic thing is to do something like this because, you know, people want to do it. They're attracted to it. And that's the ultimate form of soft power.
To me, it seems not surprising that it's PSG, a club in France which was created in '76, or Newcastle or Manchester City, which is two clubs that are ostensibly working class clubs that have been abandoned by kind of the neoliberalization of London over the years. And so that's a reason to come in there.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what club has been chosen and why they've chosen them. And so if you look at when Manchester City was bought, it was in all sorts of trouble under the Thaksin Shinawatra ownership. I mean, he had his assets stolen by the army back home because he'd been accused of all sorts of crimes. But up until then, they'd very recently been in the third tier, and they had been in the shadow of Manchester United and the red half of the city for decades. And this was an open wound for Manchester City fans. And if you ever go to what is now the Etihad Stadium, East Manchester's a pretty rundown place, or was a pretty rundown place. It's one of the poorest parts of the country. And so to come in and say, we're going to rejuvenate this area, we're going to rejuvenate your city, we're going to rejuvenate your club, right, we're going to give you pride again, that's a really powerful thing for someone to do to a football club. That you can't almost, I can't think of any other cultural artefact that would have that kind of power. And I think Newcastle was chosen for very similar reasons. If they really wanted a billboard for all their brands, they would go, and they have the money, they'd go and buy Manchester United, right? They would just give the Glazers double what they want and take it because they have more money than God, to quote David Conn's book. They don't. Newcastle United, you build a sense of appreciation and respect for the people that have saved your club and then saved your city because of all of the lack of investment. I mean, you talk to people and they say, look, our city was known for the shipbuilding capital of the world. Right? We were the coal mining and exporting capital of the world, right? And that goes, what do we have? We have Newcastle United. It becomes so much more than just a football club. It becomes the identity of the city. It becomes the only thing that the city is kind of known for anymore.
The example of the US coming into the World Cup in 2026, hosting this Club World Cup, which they're already looking for a new team to participate in it. Several clubs have said they don't want to participate. Now the £1 billion seems like a ridiculous overcompensation. Infantino's name's on the trophy twice. We're meant to host the World Cup now with Donald Trump arguing with Mexico and trying to invade Canada. And the Glazers have created a disaster. Virtually no U.S. owner have had much success in football besides maybe Liverpool.
Like Liverpool's owners have been.
That's the one exception, really. I mean, in Italy, they've all had a terrible go at it. What does this also kind of say for how much more successful these kind of Middle Eastern royal families' attempts and forays into football have been?
I think it's arrogance, right? American owners are incredibly arrogant. They think, listen, we've won this. We've won this lottery, right? I own the Knicks, or I own the Broncos or something. I've made money in American sports franchises. It's the most profitable sporting kind of leagues in the world. Closed leagues, cartels, but that's how we do it. So we're going to come to football and we're going to tell you how we do it. Middle Eastern owners don't do that. They've come in and they very smartly know, because these are some of the smartest people in the world and also very good at image and message manipulation. And they come in and they have immediately looked at the situation and they've played an absolute blinder. If they make profit out of it, great, but that's not the motivation. So they've just been far smarter and far more strategic than the Americans. I think that's why you see them fail in Italy and really, alienate pretty much everyone at any club they've gone to, aside from Liverpool. But even then, they'll raise the price one time. Then Spirit of Shankly will be out, and then so the appreciation is thin, I think.
Is it working? Is it somehow creating a more morally relativized world, this kind of sports washing process? At this point, I don't know what is more unethical, a World Cup run by Donald Trump or a World Cup in this instance.
Well, listen, what the rise of MBS, and then the fall of MBS after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then the rise of MBS again afterwards, has shown is that this type of autocratic, strongman attitude to politics and in the organisation of almost every level has won, right? I don't know whether democracy in the long term can survive it, whether it's going to survive. The fact that Donald Trump has got re-elected, it was his first election that led ultimately to Newcastle United being bought, because it led to the unshackling of MBS so that he felt that he could crack down on any form of internal dissent, to the point where it led to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which then in turn led to a rethinking about how we reconnect to the world, and then the purchase of Newcastle United, and then this massive revolution in purchasing sports all around the world. The world has changed. FIFA's changed. As corrupt as FIFA was giving Qatar the World Cup in the first place in 2020 and 2022, and there were the US Justice Department. I mean, so many corruption arrests and allegations. We live in a new era with Infantino being representative of a new type of autocracy where there's no corruption because we don't have an election. There's no corruption. You don't have paper bags passing money between people or expensive watches. It's governments making these decisions behind the scenes, and they're just, fait accompli, just presented a document which they don't even vote on. It's vote by acclamation. With this World Cup, there's going to be a fraction of the criticism, if any, I mean, 10 years is a long time. So who knows? I mean, Donald Trump might still be in power. He might decide that actually we're going to get rid of term limits. We don't know. But the world looks like it's heading in a direction more towards the ones that reflects the Saudi attitude to the world than it is towards a democratic liberal way of the world. So the World Cup will go ahead, and it will be forced to be a success, even if it's not.
Do you think at some point people are going to get disillusioned with the show?
We've been waiting for that, and they don't. You know, because it's not picking up. It's not your favourite newspaper. It's not Uber. It's not your favourite social media platform, right? Ultimately, if those change, whatever, it's annoying, right? But you move on. If you find out that Uber is super, immoral, you delete it. You use Bolt instead. That isn't what built football. That isn't what gave football its special status, I think, in world culture. There's nothing like it. I think we are heading to a really dark place, but ultimately we're still tethered to this because there's very few things that physically represent our identity. It's why ultras are so popular. What other physical communities exist for young people? Very few. The people who are making these decisions realise that investing in football and investing in these clubs gives them something that almost no other single cultural entity can give them, which is something that you can't walk away from. The end.